Hello and welcome. Welcome back to Deep Noetics. And today I've got Brian Becker here from the YouTube channel Singularity as Sublimity. Thanks for joining me here, Brian. And why don't you start off and explaining your channel name to us? Why is it called Singularity as Sublimity?
Yeah, happy to, and thanks for having me here today. So the choice of singularity as sublimity, I think in part that's influenced from both my interest in phenomenology and psychoanalysis. Lacan early on talks a lot about singularity, and that's often in regards to the subject, the unconscious subject, and its unique positioning in relationship to what he calls the big other.
Mhm.
But in phenomenology, there's also the notion of singularity as well, which is an attempt to communicate the unique and distinctive element of the self as it gets sort of constituted in its context and its relationships. Um, it's opposed to the idea of individuality. It's so individuality and singularity are not the same thing.
Okay.
So singularity is in the way it's often used is a way of thinking about um, the self in its um, more in its situatedness and it's not and individuality is often thought of as I'm an individual unique and as opposed to you
Mhm.
who's another individual who's unique, and singularity is the way it's often used has more of a relational understanding as to um, that is not reducible to like an individual, and an individual is always a one of still many kinds of individuals, and so it's trying to think about a category of selfhood that's not um, can't be situated within a series of higher categories, so to speak. And the reason why sublimity is there is because I think that this idea of singularity is sort of the highest concept, the most important concept that is worth exploring in
Mhm.
philosophy and psychoanalysis. And I think thinkers like Jacques Lacan, um, Mari Rudy, who wrote a book on this, borrowing from Lacan's thoughts, and then thinkers like Emmanuel Levinas, Jean-Luc Marion, other recent phenomenologists have all sort of had their own approach to this concept and have elevated it to a very high status in their thought.
Okay. And mentioning Lacan and Levinas, is this, let's say, if you look at a more uh, scientific relation to these concepts, would you say, more touched upon within the sphere of psychology then?
So when you say it, like the singularity
Yeah,
aspect of it.
these concepts, because like my background
Mhm.
is actually in physics, and we have very different usage of the word singularity, for example, obviously a
Mhm.
very different one. But like a lot of these concepts seem to me, and in general with these phenomenological concepts, it seems to me like there's a an application that pertains to the more psychoanalytical, um,
Mhm.
rather than, or at least not as much in let's say natural science or in something
Mhm.
like physics, right? That's I'm just interested in that because I've commented from that angle, and I'm now trying to see how these approaches can be and should be relevant for
Yeah.
physics.
I think to the degree I understand the singularity within physics, and please correct me if I've misspoken about anything, but I think the idea of if a black hole it has a point of singularity, as a point of infinite density. It kind of has a metaphorical resonance with sort of what I'm thinking about,
Okay.
where I think there's a way in which if you take the concept of the black hole as a point of infinite density that is also not is not comprehensible within the contemporary models. Like there's a point at which the contemporary physics breaks down once you get to that point. Just like when you start going toward the very origin of the Big Bang. It's all of our concepts start breaking down. There's an incomprehensibility. There's a lack of like if light is a sense of um, metaphorically thought about as knowledge. That's
Mhm.
where light no longer light is escaping because it's so
Mm.
incomprehensible. I think there's a wonderful um, parallel there, and
Mm.
the idea that despite not being able to comprehend it, being able to and it's in its infinite depth that it has there's a gravity, there's a gravitational pull around it
Mhm.
that we feel the tug of. And I think that idea is actually very beautiful when you think about the singularity of the human being when you're encountering them, because there's a incomprehensibility that's associated with singularity. So, and this is why I was opposing it to individuality, which is I have these series of traits and goals and distinct dimensions that I can define myself as.
Yeah.
I can't. When it comes to my singularity, it's fundamentally indefinable even to me.
Right.
And so I think that idea of the way the black hole is described, at least the way I've heard it described, actually probably comes much closer to to the notion of singularity as I think about it in phenomenology and psychoanalysis than
Mhm.
anything I've gotten from the field of psychology.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. There's something that came to my mind whilst you were explaining this, and I'll just brainstorm it to you, and you let me know what you think. So I often thought about the connection of these kind of aspects from physics, like the singularity. But what I think is also relevant is the event horizon, because more specifically, the event horizon is where the light cannot escape. So what is happening there is that the event horizon is ripping the space-time continuum basically into two regions. There's kind of there's the outside and the inside of the event horizon, and purely mathematically speaking, the time and the space axes they invert, they swap places. So time becomes space, space becomes time, and there's no canonical way to understand this. There's no canonical way this is like interpreted, as in we don't really know what that's supposed to mean. So all we can say is that no information can be retained behind the event horizon. And I often thought about how this event horizon, how this uh, can be generalized to a general notion of knowability, unknowability, a general notion of not being able to retain information anymore, such as you see in other domains, also in physics, like uncertainty principles and quantum mechanics and these things. And what I noticed is I found that a lot of the issues you get, and singularity purely mathematically speaking, just would just mean that your equation, your integral, your mathematical term is diverges towards infinity. It doesn't give you a finite value as a result. And these usually occur, that was my observation, whenever there is a improper reconciliation between the subjective and the objective, right? So, for example, if you look at field theories in physics, what they often do is they have a field continuum, but to then use that field continuum to make predictions, calculations, they put a so-called test particle in it. And the test particle is defined by not having any reaction or back reaction onto the field. Because as soon as you implement it with a feedback effect on the field and the field's having a feedback effect on the particle, then you immediately end up with singularities, even in very basic field equations and fields calculations. And So in what you have with relativity as well as quantum mechanics, you suddenly have this the subjects, the Cartesian subjects suddenly cannot be fully ignored. There's suddenly some relevance to the observer. Uh, Not as intense in general relativity as you'd have it in quantum mechanics, but you suddenly have this subject that until then you kind of got away with leaving out. But now you have it there, and that's where you have these problems arising. And uh, correct me now, you correct me if I'm wrong. This singularity then in the purely like subjective sense, it's almost like this the metaphor with with the black hole. It's almost like this subject that you've removed all of its individuality from, and it's just that core that's left. It's almost like like how Husserl's beginning of phenomenology began with Cartesian meditations, right? It is kind of trying to reduce it down to that singular point that's no longer reducible to find the bedrock. Um,
Mhm.
what do you think of this? I'll let you say something before I go on too long.
Yeah. There's a couple of different points I think I'll address, which is one, the idea of the event horizon. Second, the relationship between subject and object, and in light of, say, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and theory of relativity. And then the third point was what you just mentioned around, oh geez, I just lost it. I'll address those first 2 points, and then maybe the third one will just come to me. But so I love that you brought up the idea of of an event horizon, because the event, a phenomenology of the event is integral to the notion of singularity. And this goes back to Heidegger, who's really sort of the originating figure of the notion of the event.
Hmm.
And um, and the idea is that their events are like these unpredictable and unforeseeable moments of explosion, really, that transforms everything that happens afterwards. And um, you can think of a historical event, for example. Something happens, and we no one could foresee what that was going to happen.
Hmm.
It happens, and then it completely reconfigures the field, the situation.
Hmm.
And there is a horizon around that. There's an interpretive horizon that
Hmm.
starts to emerge, um, a, a field of possibility that it sort of springs forth um, from the events. Now, that when it comes to the person, it is often thought of, and birth is often that moment. If you look at birth phenomenologically, it's not we're not talking about biological, um, as a birth as a concept, as a scientific idea, but the idea that there is a moment in time that precedes you and your self awareness of yourself, that there's a history to yourself that precedes yourself, and you are sort of entering into that stream of this explosion that happened,
Hmm.
phenomenologically speaking, and you're always, in a sense, always late to yourself. You are entering into the
Hmm.
stream of your own event that has its own history and possibilities and all that is incomprehensible even to you. And that's partly why there is a singularity to yourself, and that your singularity is incomprehensible because you were born, and because you were born,
Right.
you were always late to arriving at yourself, in the sense of you never fully coinciding with your own history.
Hmm.
And so you are always unfurling the implications and possibilities of your own birth,
Hmm.
all the way until you die, which is, in a sense, as we see with Heidegger, sort of the ultimate. completion of that, the ultimate possibility of the end of all your possibilities.
Yeah.
And and you as a singularity that's defined by the event of birth, you are always coming into your horizon, the event horizon that you are coming in contact, you are within, is always coming into contact with the event horizons of others who
Hmm.
are their own points of singularity.
Hmm.
And and once you come into contact with that, there's in a sense no escaping it because you are now there's this fusion of horizons in such a way as to being you are unable to fully escape from that gravitational pull because it in a sense transforms
Hmm.
the entire interaction.
Hmm.
So I think there's some there, and there's more we could say about that, but there's a lot of again wonderful metaphors, and some of the phenomenologists that I've read have actually drawn upon this notion of the black hole to be able and the event horizon as a way of conceptualizing philosophically uh, what they're trying to say in a more philosophical sense. Um,
Yeah.
now,
I
when it
mean,
comes, sorry, go ahead.
sorry. Something that would be another, you could say, fitting analogy there is also that event horizons, ca just physically speaking, cannot contract, but can only expand, right? So if
Yes.
you have another black hole merging with it, it will expand and potentially end up with less surface area than the sum of both original ones. But the black hole can never the total surface can never shrink. So the horizon is essentially something that is expanding and
Mhm.
that is transforming, but it doesn't contract. At
Mhm.
least, I mean, so far there's no proof for Hawking radiation and these kind of things, but we don't need to stretch the analogies too far. What I found interesting in this context is how throughout you could say it probably started with Kant. There was this attempt to reground space and time in something more fundamental, right? And something that goes beyond just pure measurement relations and all that. But there was an attempt at salvaging absolute space as like a sort of pure cognition, a pure form of perception. And I see this developing, especially getting into Husserl and Heidegger, into into a kind of space that emerges. I feel like there's a real notion of emergent space or space time coming about through the anchor of the event. So there is a certain event and you have a relationship to that event, or there's a certain place. It's almost like the place or the situation is more fundamental. And from your interrelationship to these places and situations, the space emerges. It's not like the space was already there as an empty receptacle, an empty canvas, but that space actually emerges and it can transform and change and adapt depending on your current interrelationship structure between places and events. And I think I'm my suspicion is that this is in a sense the you could say ontological origin of space-time becoming transformable and what's it called curved and changing its shape as it does in general relativity. And that is kind of what I am interested in, or what I've been getting into is like, is there a rigorous notion of introducing this phenomenal space into physics by saying that, okay, space-time continuum, it's not actually fundamental. It's not like it's given and that's how it is and that's how it'll always be. It is actually something that you could almost say emerges, evolves, depending on the phenomenological interrelationships between events and situations that Dasein is thrown into, so to say.
Yeah. I think, yeah, at least within phenomenology, there's this idea that the kind of notions of space and time that are derived from the sciences are are themselves derivative of this more fundamental relationship to space and time that uh, beginning with Husserl he discusses, but then it changes with Heidegger and then other thinkers. And our relationship with time is not primarily linear, and our relationship with space is not primarily in terms of objective distances. It has a kind of, like you say, a curvature. In fact, Emmanuel Levinas, when he talks about the relationship with the other, he talks about it as a curvature of space, and that the other comes for me from a place of height.
Hmm.
And other thinkers will talk about the concept of distance as a that there's a, say, for between you and I there is a there yes there's a physical distance, like you're in Germany right now,
Yeah,
or
yeah, Germany.
yeah, so like, so there's a physical distance, but there's also a kind of proximity
Mm,
that is more real to me than your physical distance right now because
right.
of our exchange and our
Mm,
interaction. Um, and so there's in a sense a more that's a more primordial way I'm relating to my reality. I'm really relating to you as a proximity of relationship, and at the same time you are actually at the same time you are actually even more distant than the objective distance, because there's an excess and transcendence of you that is so far beyond what I'm able to
mm,
comprehend that I can't even measure it in terms of object that it extends far greater than the
hmm.
objective distance between you and I right now. And that's also very real. And in order for me to and this is the paradox of a relationship, right? There's in a sense a proximity of intimacy that it brings one closer, and there's also an infinity, a distance, because of your fundamental unknowability of your consciousness, of your life, of your the singularity around which the that emerges from the event of your birth. And
Hmm.
so I'm in relationship to both of those things at the same time. And that is, again, if I reflect on it, if I think about what emerges first as a way of relationship with the world, it's that.
Hmm.
Um, and um, and one of the dangers sometimes of the scientific approach is that I will the there's a temptation of objectifying you, turning you into something that can be fit within the framework of the sciences, that collapses the distance, um, and collapses and removes all proximity
Hmm.
at the same time, such that you become a this object within three-dimensional geometric space and time. So I think that's some of the dangers around that, at least with the standard miles. Now, I think, again, when we
Yeah.
return to these more newer forms of science, so to speak, they're not so new anymore, but we have some ways of thinking about time and space that actually create more resonances. And
Yeah.
and when it comes to time, interestingly, this is one of the things that I think a lot of phenomenologists have done. Is like normally, we think of we sometimes we conceptualize space in terms of time. So you are how many hours away from me, right? And how long will it take for me to get to you? But in another way of looking at that phenomenologically is that my future is located in that distance between you and I, such that if I was to get to know you, if I was to
Hmm.
try to be able to approximate that infinite distance that you have from me, that is in a sense the future of my relationship with you.
Hmm.
And what's more important in my future is not what's going to happen in an hour from now when I move on to the next thing, but my future is determined by this sort of the spatial coordinates of between you and I, where the distance between myself and you
Hmm.
is something that my future as a possibility could actualize as becoming more
Right.
acquainted with. So
Right,
I
right.
think there's an inversion of space and time there that can happen as well, phenomenologically speaking.
Yeah, yeah, and I think there is also another danger that I'm kind of worried about when I kind of try and formalize or turn these kind of considerations into something tangible, scientific.
Mhm,
It's the notion that like if we expand the notion of the self to be something that in tries to include this whole interrelationship of sense and meaning and significance within the world.
mhm,
And we have these massive horizons that are intersecting now in this case where you and I are communicating. Um, it is always necessary to engage in some form of reduction, and some forms of reduction can be bad, can be like uh,
mhm,
tur turning into something like that Heidegger would have critiqued with his critique of technology, where
mhm,
we are basically reducing all of the self down to a database, basically, to a database of all of my structural relationships to whatever areas and domains of my life. But that
mhm,
is not necessarily a something that can be reduced that way. It's not necessarily separable in distinct data categories. It's not necessarily exhaustive or not necessarily something that can be ever completed as it is continuously generating and all that.
mhm,
So I see the danger there as well to not end up in a sort of technological reduction or something that I don't know how familiar you are with Deleuze. I feel like Deleuze has this like machine language about everything, where
mhm,
everything is just flattened into the immanent sphere of
mhm,
machines and cogs kind of. And so that is, I think, always the danger whenever you engage in formalizing something to make it useful for pure natural science, for math and physics. You always risk to basically basically like rip out the plant without its roots, right?
mhm,
And kind of
mhm,
just have something that's become lifeless once you've turned it into a formalism. I think
mhm,
that's one of the risks there, because like the event is a good example. I read when I read Heidegger in German, a lot of the language he uses, which is why I think it's much harder to read him in English. A lot of
mhm,
the language he uses is like kind of written in a way that like if you know German, you kind of know what he means, but he uses the word differently, or he kind of makes up a new way of using the word, but it's kind of because German is set up in a way you can combine and recombine prefixes, suffixes, and words. It's kind of like intuitively clear what kind of double meaning he's conveying there,
mhm,
which you kind of have to force in there when you translate it into English. And
yeah.
and then you end up with a lot of like new words that you have to learn. It becomes a much more difficult task. And I
Mhm,
think with the event, it's a good example because he plays on this um, word Ereignis, which is the
mhm,
event, as being something that ereignet, meaning kind of it assembles. It's not just an event, but it kind of assembles, which
mhm,
is distinct from causality, right? It assembles past, present, and future in its modes together in their openness to each other. Um,
mhm,
so it's kind of like a different and exactly different from uh, causality, from classical
mhm,
scientific causality. And he also
yeah.
says the Ereignis is an Enteignis, which is like a play on words which you can't doesn't apply in English, which
Mhm,
means that like the that which gives, that which assembles itself recedes. Like that which assembles cannot be grasped. The assembly of the event uh, conceals at the same time the event itself, or the ground of the event itself. And
mhm,
this like revealing and concealing that is core to phenomenology, that is something I don't know whether that's formalizable at all, whether that's uh whether one should even try to formalize it, or whether it just makes things worse, if you know what
mhm,
I mean.
yeah. Well, one thing I one pick up on one thing about around the your description of Heidegger's notion of the event as the in a sense not being caused and as a gathering together,
Mhm.
sort of a that has a degree of spontaneity to it. Some later thinkers will interestingly even talk about the inversion of cause and effect in this regard, right? So if you think about event and effect as a kind of sort of parallel way, when we when I think about an event like with the COVID it would be an event 9/11 in the United States, these traumatic events,
Mhm.
or even the event of my birth. Um, these are all could all be thought of as effects with prior causes that I can describe. I could look at what are the precedents and preceding factors that led to that event. But one of the interesting things is that when we think about effects in terms of events, it actually inverses the relationship that the causes themselves are the effect of the effect, right? So when an event happens, I'm then retroactively looking for causes to help account for the event, which
Mhm.
they never do. But the
Mhm.
very search for causes, for causality, is itself a byproduct of the event having already happened. And so I am always constantly retroactively seeking causes. And like with my birth, I described being late to myself. I'm always late to the causes to the event that has happened. And that the whole search for causes itself is a byproduct of the event even happening. And
Mhm.
because of that lateness, no, it isn't always impossible, especially when it comes to any event, to ever find the cause or complete set of causes, um, because there's never ever because the event is always something unprecedented. It's something that always exceeds what comes before it, and so there's an interesting inversion of the typical scientific model that thinks of causes and effects in a linear way
Mhm.
and doesn't really account for that retroactivity that happens
Mhm.
with events.
Yeah, yeah, I have a thought here where I think it is relevant now to speak about the notion of like the unconscious, because there is something about these events that can be predicted or sensed without causality, something that is beyond causality, that anticipates events beyond being able to attribute any form of determined causality. Um, and this is where I think it's kind of, yeah, it's relevant to look at where that would come from, because the approach I'm looking at is finding some sort of common core, this common core between the subject and object, that which Heidegger spoke of, but also
Mhm.
just this general attempt that you could categorize as dual aspect monism, as a monism that is essentially subject object or psychophysically neutral,
Mhm.
um, that that allows to bind the subjective and the objective in
Mhm.
such a way that they become reconciled and allow for something like unconscious eruptions to occur that can
Mhm.
anticipate events without causal inference. So um,
Mhm.
Kant, for example, probably still remained to some extent in an unreconciled state between the subject and object, which then was taken up by, I'd say, Hegel and Schopenhauer in their own ways. Obviously,
Mhm.
Schopenhauer didn't like Hegel at all, but
Mhm.
the thing in itself for Kant was still not accessible. It was still locked away. It was still like the singularity behind the event horizon. The event horizon being all the phenomena, all the appearances, and
Mhm.
the thing in itself being the singularity that can never be accessed. Um,
Mhm.
but then, whilst Hegel wanted to reconcile it by considering the thing in itself basically part of a thought movement of absolute spirit, or Schopenhauer looking at the thing in itself as being part of the will that is not separate from the individual will and all that. There is
Mhm.
some attempt to try and find what is underlying, and I think uh, the first, in my view, the first attempt to really reground, reestablish a deeper foundation for the self that goes much deeper and much broader than the Cartesian ego. I think I would say maybe you have a other suggestion, but I would say it comes from Nietzsche actually. I read it specifically, and I, as preparation, actually got it here. I read it specifically in when he speaks of the despisers of the body
Mhm.
in Thus Spake Zarathustra.
Mhm.
And he speaks of the spirit, the I, the ego being a little sagacity, whilst the big sagacity is the self. And he
Mhm.
sometimes speaks of the self being like the deep wisdom of the body,
Mhm.
and something like that.
Mhm.
And as you are, as I have the impression you are much deeper in that kind of aspect of phenomenology, especially looking at Lacan and stuff. I'm not very familiar with Lacan at all. Um,
Mhm.
how do you look at these kind of aspects of the self that seem to cut
Mhm.
deeper than the separations of subject and object?
Yeah. Well, first off, I would agree with you about Nietzsche, and you know, maybe some of my audience that are big fans of Hegel would not like this, but for me, Nietzsche was the most important philosopher of that century, and so much. Every time I'm reading someone more modern, more recent, I go back to Nietzsche. I'm like, Nietzsche said something like that. There's so much goes back to that. So I I, I do agree with linking a lot of the origins of contemporary thought to Nietzsche. Um, it's interesting because there's so many different ways in which the subject-object relationship has been addressed. I'm very recent. I just put up a video um, yesterday, I think, Sartre's analysis of the body. And he specifically mentioned he's dealing specifically with the unity of subjectivity and objectivity and in describing the body and the sensation and action and how, um, and he does even reference explicitly theory of relativity and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle in that chapter. And
I gotta check it out then.
Yeah, it's very relevant to this conversation. It was sort of a coincidence. I was happening to be looking at that while in anticipation of this conversation,
Hmm.
and it talks a lot of in his analysis of sensation. So he's analyzing the body. What is the body? He's critiquing the idea of the body as purely an object. That's a derivative idea, but the body is not something purely subjective either. And he in describing the sensations, right, there is a sensation itself can or probably what is more properly called perception itself, uh though it perceives objects, it cannot be an object itself. You cannot perceive your perceiving, right? So it has this subjective dimension that's unable to become rendered objective, and yet the only way I come to know perception is through the my perception is through the objects that I'm perceiving. And so the objects of perception are an extension or a revelation, he says, of perception. And so it's impossible to formally distinguish subjectivity and objectivity because they're so interpenetrated with each other. He talks about them, uh, that reality is itself the composition, the kind of interdependence, the dialectical relationship. You would talk about it as between subjective and objective, and this extends to the entire body and the body in action. So when you are um, so there's a way in which you cannot your arms are not, when you use your hand to write, your hand is not a tool. It is not like you're using a tool and then you're using this tool to use another tool, which is a pen. And he says that's the wrong way of thinking about it, that my hand is not a tool. My hand is my intentionality expressing itself, expressing its possibilities in the use of the pen. And so it's not itself an object of that in the same way as the pen is. And so there's this mistaken way where you think about our bodies in that way as objects. And yet he then adds, because he's always doing this dialectical
Yeah.
back and forth. He says, the only way I actually come to know my hand in any way is through the pen,
Hmm.
because the pen is the extension of my hand into the world as a form of action, as a form of realizing my possibilities. And so, or it could be the cane or the telescope or what have you. All these are ways in which my body is revealed to me. Again, illustrating the inseparability between subject and object. Now, when you move to Lacan, there's some similarities there. I think Zizek, Slavoj Žižek, has attempted to formalize what Lacan was saying into a materialist ontology. So it might actually be
Okay.
helpful to talk about him here. For
Hmm.
Slavoj Žižek, the way he has attempted to do it, and he does this analysis in his several places, but one of them is called the parallax view. And the parallax view is just the parallax in psychology is the idea that you can look at the say your thumb from one angle to the other angle. It's the same thumb, but it looks differently depending upon the perspective you take on it. And he applies that sort of idea um, to his materialist ontology, that reality itself is objective and subjective at the same time, and you can take a different perspective on it. But the reason why there's even subjectivity in the first place, he says, is because objectivity itself, or material reality itself, is incomplete. There's a fundamental incompleteness in reality, that and it's this incompleteness or contradiction within reality itself that allows for the possibility for consciousness subjectivity to emerge. And so you have to be able to attend to the internal contradiction of reality to be able to understand subjectivity. And so the idea of how do we connect a subject to an object is a mistaken idea,
Hmm.
because he thinks that it's actually subjectivity is objectivity, or is material reality more precisely, itself. But we have to have a new materialist ontology. We cannot think about reality in this sort of more traditional scientific sense as something
Mm.
complete in itself, as
Yeah, yeah,
as
yeah.
something as something that somehow can be understood independent of subjectivity. So these are two very different ways of going about some fairly different ways of going about the problem of subject and object, and trying to think about their fundamental unity.
Right,
Um, yeah, one is more phenomenological, and one is much more trying to create a new materialism, and so
right.
focused more on um, almost a metaphysics in a sense.
Yeah, yeah. And in this context, how would the distinction between being in itself and being for itself play out? Because I actually like repeatedly watched your video on that, and I'm not fully sure if I fully understood it, but I I read this work by Schelling. Have you ever heard of the Treatise on Freedom by Schelling?
I, mhm.
Um,
I haven't read it closely, but yes, I'm familiar with it.
yeah, so he makes a difference there between um was it God as a ground and God himself.
Hmm.
He uses those in different ways. And
Hmm.
one is God as a ground is kind of, it's at the same time the unground. It is the groundlessness of the ground. God as a ground, as the ground of all existence, is
Hmm.
something that's not graspable. It's almost like the singularity, right? Whereas God himself is that ground after it has kind of escaped or expanded out of that ground and returned to
Mhm.
become himself, to become God himself, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I wonder, is that a right way or a similar way of putting it when it comes to the distinction of being in itself and for itself? The in itself is the as the ground, and the for itself is the as himself, kind of in that analogy. That like
Yeah.
the for itself is that necessary escape out of the in itself in
Yeah.
order to kind of you can't complete the self, but to kind of how would you say complete at least one iteration of the self.
Mhm. I think that does parallel well Sartre, and so I guess the way I would think about it in terms of Sartre would be uh, so there is we in a sense we begin with being in itself. If you think about it like chronologically, I guess being in itself is just reality as it would be without subjectivity. I guess it's not like something we directly would ever experience. It's a kind of he talks about it as a solidity or infinite density because there's no subjectivity related to it. But some aspect this being in itself, human beings are the being in itself that has somehow negated itself, and
Hmm.
there's this act uh, of negation that gives rise to the for itself. So
Hmm.
the for itself is not a thing. It's not like and it's not like it's not an emergent property of the in itself, but it's I guess maybe in some way it's very similar to Zizek in that it's there's an internal negativity
Hmm.
to the in itself that creates the necessary space for the for itself to emerge as a possibility that can actually now reflect on the in itself.
It kind of it
And
repulses you in a sense,
Mhm.
in a necessary way to establish the circuit, right? The
Mhm.
circuit of the self.
Yeah.
Because if you stay there, it's kind of like the singularity. You can't escape it. There won't be anything you can know,
Mhm.
and thus making it locked away. Um, so it's strangely like a precondition for the for itself, but it is also something that the precondition also entails never really remaining at the in itself, if I understand it.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. We never like we're constantly well. There's a tension. There remains dialectical tension there because um, the in itself is always something that I remain, but this thing that I remain, this essence, this sort of that I am, is always something I'm in a constant state of negating. So that it's not like I want at one point consciousness arose and then it's sort of left behind the in itself. The for itself is the constant perpetual process of negating itself, the in itself, to be itself. And so it's a process that goes on until death, at which point, at least Sartre says, we kind of become it's the point at which the for itself it becomes equated with the in itself in death. Um, and there's no consciousness there. There's nothing. It's just complete um, um, solidity or nothingness.
Yeah, I got a question in that context. It's like you said that you consider Nietzsche more relevant in that regard as Hegel. And
Mhm.
would you agree in that context then that Hegel, although you could argue otherwise based on depending on what part of Hegel you read, but that
Mhm.
Hegel kind of remains within the disembodied spirit framework in a sense. He remains within a framework of a dialectics that's kind of projected. Um, that is already like pointing in the right direction, but what is lacking is this rootedness, this kind of anchoring
Mhm.
in the ultimate dialectic, so to say, which is that of your being towards death, the ultimate
Mm-hmm.
that is your the pure spirit or the absolute spirit that is just projected is
Mm-hmm.
by its definition not anchored. And what it's lacking is that the ultimate horizon or the ultimate constraint upon which this dialectic can play out needs to be anchored in the ultimate uh, dialectic of death, kind of the
Mm-hmm.
ultimate the foundational negation of the phenomenal world.
Mm-hmm. Sartre, because Sartre is both obviously he's borrowing from Hegel, but he's critical about Hegel in the sense that for his critique of Hegel is that he in a sense it remains still overly abstract. That the dialectic that he talks about between self and other is a dialectical that leads to a dialectical synthesis of absolute spirits. So this return to absolute spirits, this and the idea of Hegel placing this, according to Sartre, placing himself in the position where he can assume that perspective of absolute spirit to be able to describe it, to be able to account for this dialectical unfolding over the course of history, things that Sartre very much disagrees with. And for Sartre, at least, he's always going back to that what is most fundamental is not absolute spirit. It is the concrete relationship of the concrete or particularity of the for itself and its lived experience. So he's always
Hmm.
returning to that highly concrete situation.
Hmm.
You could
Hmm.
perhaps, I'm not sure Sartre would go here, but you could perhaps think about because that being toward death as also reflecting that focus because every Dasein is in its unique relationship towards its being toward death.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so it's not a general principle, it's not an abstract idea. It is a concrete way in which the individual, or maybe we say the singularity, lives
Hmm.
out its concrete existence.
Okay.
And any attempt to go to extrapolate beyond that or to suggest there's something more primary, universal, is a mistaken move for someone like Sartre.
Okay,
Now,
okay, I understand.
there's a lot of disagreements about how Sartre is interpreting Hegel here, and I won't probably don't want to get into all that complicated uh, interpretation issue, but at least that's how Sartre sees himself being distanced from Hegel.
Okay, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah. And can you get into a little bit, or how much time do we have left?
Maybe about, I could go another 10 minutes.
Okay, okay. Well then, how can you expand a bit then into back into the notion of the unconscious, as you're also referring to Lacan at times, who was a psychoanalyst, as far as I understand. Me personally, when it comes to psychoanalysis, I've touched most upon Carl Jung, because I
Mhm.
actually find that Carl Jung was somewhat of a phenomenologist that just kind of didn't really concern himself with philosophy much. He ventured into into this territory without really bothering himself much with the questions of what the foundations of that territory are. Um,
Mhm.
but in that sense as well, he does borrow from this Nietzschean notion of the self. Like he does make a
Mhm.
difference between the ego and
Mhm.
the self essentially being something that cannot be fully grasped. The ego is essentially a necessary idol or a necessary, yeah, like image of the
Mhm.
self that constantly maintains a relationship with the self, and this relationship ends up. It's contradictory in the sense that this relationship leads to the archetype of the shadow emerging, like the shadow
Mhm.
and the ego both being part of the self.
Mhm.
Whilst the ego, that's the contradiction. The ego only understands itself as the ego. However, the self contains the ego and the shadow, the essential
Mhm.
negation of the ego to some extent.
Mhm.
And so the archetypes, as he describes them, as they are unconscious and part of the self, but yet capable of residing outside of the ego, or
Mm-hmm.
intersecting with the ego, but still possible of having elements that lie outside of the ego, thus outside of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
They're given their own kind of dynamics that cannot be neatly categorized as the subjective or the objective. There's something new to that structure, and I'd be really interested, and probably should read it myself as well, but I'd be really interested in how what your perspective is, and what you've learned from people like Lacan about this.
Yes. Yeah. So I think one of the things that Lacan emphasizes is the um, the idea of the split subject, and the idea that you cannot be uh, um, a self or a subject without this split. That there's a fundamental divide that can never be reconciled. Um, Much in the way as with Sartre, you can never be a fully in itself or or fully whole being, because you're always negating yourself as a condition of possibility to be a self.
Yeah.
So I think and I always saw that. I used to read a lot of Jung back in college and in graduate school,
Hmm.
and from my recollections, uh, I always see the difference as one of the emphasis on whole. There's an emphasis on wholeness in Jung and
Hmm.
integration, whereas I don't think that is what uh, Lacan means when he's
Hmm.
talking about the relationship with the unconscious. It's also the case that the unconscious is not a it's not really a thing. It's not and it's not internal. It's not it is it has there is an internalized element to it there, because the unconscious is the in part the internalization of the laws and language symbolic order of the social reality that one is born into. And there's a traumatic element of being introduced into a symbolic order, and there's always a misrecognition that goes on in in regards to one's own desires and the desires of social reality, and one is constantly trying to reconcile or come to terms with the contradiction of those desires that we're faced. And rather than say that we're trying to bring about a reconciliation of that, the contradiction itself is what we are. We
Hmm.
are the contradiction of this internalized, repressed dimension that that's not allowed to be expressed
Hmm.
and communicated in language, and the demands and laws and regulations of the social
Hmm.
structure that is um, keep telling us what to desire and how to desire it. So I think of this unconscious in Lacan as a much more social notion,
Hmm.
as much more tied to language rather than images and archetypes. So look,
Hmm.
Jung, from my recollection, talks a lot about the unconscious in terms of these giving rise to sort of symbols and
Hmm.
images that represent different aspects of the collective unconscious. And
Yeah.
I think for Lacan, he relegates all ideas of images um, and that those kinds of symbols to the level of the imaginary, and thus it's also connected very much to the ego, in a
Hmm.
sense. It's a very at least from what I recall, that his critique of Jung was around basically taking what he calls the imaginary, which is the plane where the ego resides, and rendering it, turning it into what is completely the unconscious. And
Mm. And collective as
Lacan,
well, right?
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, the idea of collect. And Lacan doesn't have, he has no uh, connection to the idea of a collective unconscious, other than the idea that language is a shared social algorithm in a sense, that um, that we internalize. So there's a collective element because there's a way to become a subject. I have to internalize a
Mm-hmm.
language and become under the constraints of
Mm-hmm.
that language. And to be in a shared social reality means that you have to do that as well. And the reason why we can have a conversation, why we can sort of move forward in a way that to some degree we both can make sense of what we're saying to each other is because we have this sort of shared symbolic reality that we're participating in. Now, in psychosis, the problem of what happens is that so I think Jung has a much more favorable view of psychosis as sort of maybe more connected to the unconscious, whereas Lacan thinks of psychosis as a interrupted internalization of the symbolic order,
Mm-hmm.
such that we're not able to share in the same social reality in quite the same way because we're not beholden to the authority of that symbolic order in the same in the way that most would be. So it's a very different way, and Lacan is obviously very complicated. I'm trying my best not to get into the weeds with it. It's hard not to sometimes, but those are some of the differences. Some differences that strike me initially
Yeah, yeah.
between.
What I find, I like to sometimes make an analogy there because uh, like I said, I'm not very familiar with Lacan and these types of writers, but I feel like it's almost like the unconscious, and that's in Jung's later works. It becomes more apparent, especially in his letter exchanges with Wolfgang Pauli, with the
Mhm.
physicist,
Mhm.
which is part of the literature I'm basing my current work on. Is
Mhm.
that the unconscious he refers to, and that's the word he uses in between as psychoid. It is proto psychic. It's actually back to what I mentioned earlier, this
Mhm.
kind of psychophysically neutral monism, or what
Mhm.
Jung refers to sometimes as the unus mundus, the one world underlying it, kind of referring in that case to alchemical concepts. That
Mhm.
it is actually there's actually a ground that someone like David Bohm, the physicist, would refer to as the implicate order, that hasn't really differentiated yet into a physical or a psychic. In a sense, you could call it, it's kind of compressed and fragmented,
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
at least for someone that tries to uncover it and tries to make it explicate. And I
Mhm.
feel like that is a useful way of understanding it, that like this our sense relationship, our internal structure, or you could call it the semantic web of our language and its meaning, interrelations and web of references. The structure of that, which is not something you can ever map out entirely, and it's dynamic and it changes, but the structure of that kind of has our unconscious encoded in it. That's how I understand people
Mhm.
of the type of Lacan. It has it encoded in it, and like one way of decoding parts of it is in recovering symbols and images, like
Mhm.
archetypes. That's how I would understand it. Um,
Mhm.
and I'd have two questions for you. Then I guess we're kind of done here. Um,
Mhm.
we can wrap it up then. The first one is, do you think this is a helpful or useful way of understanding it? And second of all, I think it was Zizek that said it, or someone said that Deleuze is to Lacan what Jung is to Freud. And but as far as I know, Zizek meant that as a
Mhm.
critique against
Yes,
against
yes, yes, he did.
against Jung and Deleuze. So
Yeah.
the last question would be then whether you agree with that sentiment or what you think of it. But yeah, these would be my
Mhm.
two final questions before we wrap it up.
Yeah. I Okay, well, one thing is, well, so first of all, I think Lacan would be very opposed to any linking of unconscious to any kind of natural biological process, or even one that precedes our comprehension of it. In fact, I think, like Zizek, he would suggest that the unconscious is not the result of biological instincts or tendencies. It's the result that the biology of the human animal is there's a fundamental misalignment in the human animal that leads it to give rise to an unconscious, which is a something not biological. So there's a biological incompleteness, I guess you could say, to the human animal that makes possible for there to be an unconscious in the first place.
Right.
But it's not what it doesn't give rise to the unconscious like some of the neuropsychoanalysts would suggest, where they try to connect neuroscience with psychology and psychoanalysis.
Hmm.
Um, but in terms of the parallel now between Deleuze and um, Lacan, and then Jung and Freud, I not I think it would be way too simple to make that parallel for me. I have far more. I get, maybe because I've gone through Deleuze and Guattari's book, Anti-Oedipus, very carefully, and I did a whole 3 video series on that. Um, I think there's a lot more philosophical nuance to their position. Um, that even the idea of a machine, it's not. First off, it's actually borrowing heavily from Lacan. I mean, the Deleuze and Guattari are drawing a lot from Lacan and his idea, because the idea of the machine comes from Lacan and Lacan's notion of the unconscious as a machine. And we didn't get into that, but that's a whole
Hmm.
other thing. And um, so I can see the connection in the sense that, like, the idea that the influence of Spinoza and Nietzsche that are there, and I think those are, at least Nietzsche. I'm not sure Spinoza was an influence to Jung, but that idea, that sort of almost organic way of thinking about the reality, integrated and imminent way of thinking about reality. There might be some parallels, but I think they're only superficial connections, and that Deleuze is and Guattari too, are much more philosophically nuanced and much closer to Lacan, I think, especially the later Lacan, than it might initially seem.
Hmm.
Um, than I think Jung and Freud are.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when I was referring to the unconscious being some sort of fragmented, psychophysically neutral repository, so to say, then it definitely is not meant in a biological way. Like I would say it is something like a pure phenomenal sense relationship that is kind of entangled in a way, and that we cannot pierce it, that it doesn't reveal itself in a comprehensive conscious way, in a coherent conscious way. But there is means of making it or challenging it to appear in a comprehensive way, and one of which uh, could be something like symbolic archetypes, something like that. Um, but anyways, I really appreciated this conversation. Probably for a lot of viewers, a bit quick and a bit throwing around of names that not everyone can follow that easily. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I'd be glad to have you on sometime again, and maybe go through, maybe zoom in or zero in on something in more depth, and look at it from a more focused angle.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, like, if we have we have a more focused topic and we, think about that in advance, I'd be happy to kind of get into it and do it in a way that, like, I will speak in a way that doesn't presume a lot of certain kinds of knowledge.
Yeah,
Sometimes it's hard to do that
yeah,
off the cuff.
yeah,
But yeah, happy to do that. And I really enjoy the conversation, and I got very excited by what you're doing and the work. I think it's very valuable to, um, the kinds of studies you are and research you're conducting, because I think it's a been I've been noticing as a growing area of the connections between the new sciences and these other theoretical fields, and so much work has to be done. So I'm glad that you're working on that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Brian. If you want to learn more about power and its mysterious inner workings, I invite you to join the course on the dynamics of power at Halcyon Guild. Link is in the description.